On Sunday, the 15th of December in 2024, a 37-year-old real estate agent named Ronald Dumas Jr. was last seen exiting a liquor store in Huntsville, Alabama, before his black SUV would be found mysteriously abandoned the next day. At first, police insisted there was no sign of foul play, claiming his car may have just broken down and that he'd likely walked off in search of help. But despite these claims, his family were adamant that Ronald would never disappear on his own. And as the investigation progressed, their worst fears began to emerge, after it was revealed that the police had searched his vehicle 3 times without involving crime scene investigators until the final attempt, possibly contaminating crucial evidence. But to make matters even worse, after nearly 2 months of silence, the case would suddenly take a shocking turn, when authorities announced that Ronald had been abducted, with 5 suspects being linked to the case. However, after 6 months of searching, he has still not been located, either dead or alive, leaving his family devastated as they are only left to wonder, what really happened to Ronald Dumas Jr., and should the police be held responsible for the lack of answers in his case? Ronald Dumas Jr. was born in 1987 and raised in the city of Huntsville, Alabama, a place he never strayed far from, and where he eventually built both his career and his family. Described by his loved ones as dependable, devoted, and deeply rooted in his routines, Ronald was the kind of man who made his presence known not through loudness but through consistency. Ronnie, as he was affectionately called by family and friends, grew up in a tight-knit household where loyalty and family values were instilled in him from a young age. Those close to him say that even as a child, Ronnie had a warm, calming presence. He was thoughtful, respectful, and incredibly family-oriented, and these traits followed him into adulthood and shaped the man he would become. After graduating from high school, Ronnie went on to establish a career as a real estate agent. He became known in his community not just for being good at what he did, but for the way he treated people. Always genuine, always fair, and always the kind of person you'd want on your side in any deal. His professionalism and charm earned him a solid reputation, and his work ethic kept his phone ringing with clients who trusted him. But even with a growing career, Ronnie's greatest joy came from being a father, as he had 3 children who were the centre of his world, and despite the relationships not working out with their mothers, he was an extremely present parent nonetheless, constantly calling, texting, or stopping by in person, and never missing a birthday or school event to remind his children just how much he loved them. In his personal life, Ronnie maintained a relatively low profile. He was the kind of man who preferred quiet evenings with his family over nights out, and he was always the first to show up when someone needed help. Despite facing the usual challenges of adulthood, balancing work, parenting, and relationships, Ronnie carried himself with a quiet strength and maturity that made him a rock to those around him. His relationships with the mothers of his children were reportedly respectful and cooperative, with a shared focus on making sure the kids were always cared for and supported. And even when things were difficult, Ronnie made sure to stay involved in his children's lives, always choosing stability and love over chaos. So, by late 2024, Ronald was 37 years old and in a steady rhythm. He was still working in real estate, living in Huntsville, all the while managing to stay in close touch with his family every single day. He had routines, responsibilities, and people who relied on him. However, everything would suddenly change after he would mysteriously disappear on that fateful day in 2024, never to be seen alive again. On Sunday the 15th of December, the 37-year-old father would make what would be his last known contact with his family at approximately 10 p.m, where he spoke with a relative over the phone, which was, by all accounts, an ordinary conversation that carried no hint of what was about to come. But after the phone call ended, there was nothing. No follow-up messages or updates, despite the fact that he was supposed to speak to his family again later that day. So, when the next morning rolled in and there was still no word from Ronnie, concern began to creep in. For the first time, his kids hadn't heard from him, which wasn't just out of character, it was unthinkable. Ronnie would call his children every day without fail, so as the day unfolded and calls continued to go unanswered, the silence became even more alarming. Family members tried to rationalise it at first, but despite their ideas, the details just didn't seem to make sense. Ronnie wasn't the kind of man to disappear, and given his busy work schedule, it was unlike him to miss a day of work without calling ahead first. So it would be no surprise that by the evening, the worry had well and truly turned into fear. There was still no texts, calls, or any social media activity from Ronnie, and it had become abundantly clear that something was wrong, eventually leading his family to officially report him as missing to the Huntsville Police Department. On Tuesday the 17th of December, just 2 days after anyone had last spoken with him, the family of Ronald Dumas Jr. contacted the Huntsville Police Department to explain the situation. Though it had only been about 48 hours, it was clear from his family that this case should not have been treated as a casual absence. Once again, Ronnie's family expressed that this was not like him. He was a present, involved father and a consistent communicator, so the silence was more than just worrying. So, given their insistence that something was wrong, the police began their investigation by speaking with members of Ronnie's family, trying to piece together his last known movements and regular habits. They called both of his cell phones multiple times, hoping perhaps for a ring, a voicemail, or any response, but just as before, they received nothing. But it wouldn't be until the following day that a sudden and unexpected discovery would occur. Authorities in the neighbouring state of Tennessee reached out to the Huntsville Police Department at approximately 6:30 a.m. to reveal that Ronnie's black 2021 Hyundai Palisade had been found abandoned on Interstate 40 near mile marker 133, at which point it was towed away and impounded that very morning. At the time, the car didn't immediately appear to be connected to any investigation, as it was simply left on the roadside with no visible signs of distress. But after running the registration plate through their system, it was only then that they realised the vehicle belonged to a missing person. So, upon hearing this news, the Huntsville police began tracing Ronnie's digital footprint after obtaining location data from his phones. The signal revealed a journey westward, and his devices were tracked all the way to Jackson, Tennessee, roughly an hour away from where his vehicle had been found. But after continuing to follow this thread, they would eventually learn that after arriving in Jackson, both phones had been manually disconnected, meaning something nefarious had likely taken place. It was at this point that theories began to form, as nobody could understand why Ronnie would spontaneously decide to travel over to Tennessee, or why his car was found sitting on the side of a highway, completely intact, with no obvious signs of mechanical failure. For Ronnie's family, these were not just details, but terrifying pieces of a puzzle they were fearful to complete. But despite their concerns, days would continue to pass with no further updates, and the waiting began to feel unbearable as Ronnie's family braced themselves for the bad news that was sure to follow. So, given the ever-increasing severity that surrounded the case, Ronnie's family realised that the police were not looking to cooperate, and therefore they began taking matters into their own hands. On Thursday the 16th of January, exactly 1 month on from Ronnie's disappearance, his family decided to release the last known surveillance footage of the missing man to the public, in the hopes that somebody would recognise him, an act that was previously shunned by the police for its potential to compromise the investigation. However, despite their serious concerns, it wouldn't be long until this would prove itself to be a vital decision, as a witness was able to recall seeing Ronnie that night in a liquor store with 2 women that were acting suspicious. The identification of those women would then lead to a chain of events that would blow the investigation wide open, as by early February, the police began to seriously look into these suspects as potential perpetrators. Law enforcement then conducted a large-scale search across 450 acres of land, spanning from southern Memphis to Mississippi, which signalled that investigators now believed Ronnie had been taken much further than they had first believed. And yet, even with these breakthroughs, new fears continued to emerge, as one of the suspects, Sabrina Chambers, had reportedly been missing herself since January 17th. Her grandmother was the first to raise the alarm, claiming that she hadn't heard from her in weeks, which led Ronnie's family to wonder whether Sabrina had gone into hiding or whether she too had become a victim. However, despite this major update in the case, for one reason or another, the police began to go radio silent on the matter, refusing to speak to the media and even ignoring the calls of Ronnie's family for weeks. And this behaviour would only continue, leaving Ronnie's family desperate for answers as they considered all of the painful possibilities. But just as they began to fear that the truth would never be revealed, the waiting would suddenly come to an abrupt stop when the police would announce another update to the case that would shock the local community. On Friday the 7th of February, nearly 2 months after Ronnie was last seen, the nature of his case would change dramatically when the Huntsville Police Department would call a press conference to make a haunting announcement. According to the investigators, Ronnie hadn't simply vanished, but he had been abducted. They had also issued arrest warrants for 5 individuals across 2 states, citing new evidence that shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a kidnapping. This announcement was bittersweet for Ronnie's loved ones, as although it was good to finally receive an update, they didn't hear about it through a personal call, but rather they found out through the media like everyone else. Despite months of their own searching, organising and pleading with authorities, Ronnie's family learned the most important update in the case from reporters rather than the police themselves, which they later described as disrespectful and disappointing. The suspects included Quintarius White, Torrey McLaurin, Sabrina Chambers, Carissa Cash, and Kiera Simone Clark, each facing serious charges ranging from first-degree kidnapping to conspiracy and receiving stolen property. It was unclear which roles each of them played, but authorities confirmed the charges were backed by evidence, including communications and connections to the last known moments Ronnie was seen alive. By this time, it had been nearly 2 months since his car had been found abandoned on the side of Interstate 40, and while it had been searched 3 times, it wasn't until the 3rd search that a proper CSI team were brought in, meaning that any critical evidence that could have been collected early on may have already been destroyed. So, after learning about this great injustice, Ronnie's family pointed to this mishandling as one of the many signs that law enforcement failed to treat the case with urgency until it was too late. But despite their concerns, the police continued to plead their innocence, stating that between December 20th and 21st, officers had travelled to Tennessee where the car had been discovered, and a helicopter-assisted search was conducted in the area. However, this search would turn up nothing, which at the time led police to suggest that Ronnie had left voluntarily. However, regardless of their efforts to defend their actions, Ronnie's family was still not satisfied with how the case was being conducted, which is when they decided to go directly to the media, in the hopes that the public would be able to help find their missing loved one once again. On Saturday the 8th of February, Ronnie's family and supporters organised a candlelight vigil at Big Spring Park in downtown Huntsville. Over 200 people gathered beneath the fading winter sun, holding photos of Ronnie and signs that read "Bring him home" and "Fathers don't just disappear." At this time, it was clear that word of Ronnie's disappearance was no longer confined to the boundaries of Huntsville, Alabama, as what had begun as a relatively quiet case, being brushed off by authorities in its earliest days, was now gaining momentum far beyond state lines. During the event, Ronnie's sister Danielle took the microphone and through tears she reminded everyone that her brother was a man of routine, a father who regularly dropped his kids off at school and never missed a holiday, but now he had missed all of them. The vigil marked a turning point, not just for awareness, but for pressure for the police to step up their investigation, and in the days that followed, the hashtag #FindRonnieDumas began trending on social media platforms. Dozens of independent creators and activists began dissecting the timeline and urging followers to share his photo. Some even drove hours to Camden, Tennessee, where Ronnie's SUV had been found, hoping to retrace his final steps. But the media attention didn't stop there, as Ronnie's family had one more trick up their sleeve as they desperately tried to keep the momentum going. On Monday the 10th of February, the Facebook group that Ronnie's family had created for their missing loved one surpassed 10,000 members, many of whom were complete strangers who had become emotionally invested in the case. It was through this group that new leads would begin to surface, as one person claimed to have spotted one of the named suspects in a motel just south of Memphis. Another person claimed to have seen Ronnie at a gas station off Route 79 on the morning of December 16th, which was a key detail that the police had not discovered on their own. Although not every single tip could be confirmed by hard evidence, they underscored what the family had been saying since the very beginning, that if you want answers, you don't have to wait for the system. Beyond social media, the Dumas family also received support from organisations like the Black and Missing Foundation, which amplified Ronnie's case and emphasised the systematic barriers that often stall investigations for missing people of colour. In interviews, advocates pointed out that Ronnie's case mirrored a disturbing pattern. A black father goes missing. Police suspect he left voluntarily, while the family begs to be taken seriously. but only when heartbreaking evidence emerges do authorities finally act. It was a pattern the Dumas family were desperate to break. They weren't just fighting for Ronnie anymore, they were fighting for every family who had been ignored, every missing person who had been labelled as a runaway, and every case that never made it past a Facebook post. However, despite the overwhelming efforts of everybody involved in the case, to this day, Ronald Dumas Jr. remains a missing person, as his family holds on to the distant hope that they will one day get the closure that they so desperately deserve. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But despite the lack of progress in recent weeks, Ronnie's family are continuing to keep his case alive in the media, and are now offering a $10,000 reward for any information that may lead to Ronnie's location. So with this in mind, we have to stay positive that it will only be a matter of time before the truth is revealed, providing Ronnie's family with the answers they deserve, and hopefully leading them to reunite with their loved one once and for all. However, given that he has now been missing for over 6 months, alongside the disturbing details that surround the case, I can't help but feel that the likelihood of his safe return is only growing weaker as the days pass. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, just before I dive into the theories themselves, I feel it is important to acknowledge how difficult this situation must be for Ronald's family. He is a father, a son, and a friend to many, and any theory that implies he may have been harmed or is no longer with us is understandably difficult to process. So I will do my best to approach these ideas with the utmost respect, focusing on what's publicly known while avoiding unnecessary speculation. So with that being said, the first and perhaps most widely believed theory is that Ronnie was the victim of a premeditated abduction involving multiple individuals, some of whom he may have known. This theory gained serious traction after February 7th, when the Huntsville Police Department officially reclassified the case as an abduction and issued arrest warrants for 5 people, including 2 women last seen with Ronald on the night he vanished. According to evidence, he was spotted on surveillance footage entering and leaving a liquor store with these women appearing calm but never seen again afterward. Some believe he was lured into a false sense of safety, only to be handed off to others as part of a coordinated plan. It is also believed that Ronnie's disappearance may have been connected to some kind of criminal activity, potentially involving stolen property or financial motives. One of the suspects, Carissa Cash, was charged with receiving stolen property, raising questions about whether Ronnie had been carrying valuables or had any knowledge of something sensitive which could have made him a target. His abandoned SUV and the fact that his phone went dark shortly after leaving Jackson supports the idea that he may have been forcibly taken or silenced before he could alert anyone. But to add further credence to this theory, one of the suspects, Sabrina Chambers, was reportedly last seen on January 17th and has since been declared missing by her own family. Understandably, this has led some to wonder whether there has been an effort to silence people with knowledge of what happened to Ronnie, or if those involved in his disappearance are now turning on each other. If true, it complicates the search for answers and raises concerns about the dangers still present in this case. However, regardless of who was involved in Ronnie's disappearance, another question that is being asked by the public is whether or not the police should be held responsible for the lack of resolution in his case. Now, it should come as no surprise that police incompetency could have played a significant role in the lack of answers surrounding Ronnie's disappearance. From the earliest stages of the investigation, there were glaring missteps that likely compromised crucial evidence and delayed progress during a window where every hour mattered. For example, although Ronnie's black Hyundai Palisade was discovered abandoned on Interstate 40 in Tennessee just 1 day after he was last seen, the vehicle was not immediately treated as a potential crime scene. It was searched twice before a proper forensic team was brought in on the 3rd search, by which point any trace evidence that could have pointed to foul play or a suspect may have already been disturbed or lost. I understand that these actions may not have been deliberate, but this kind of negligence in handling key physical evidence can drastically limit the credibility of any investigation. In addition, Ronnie was not officially added to the Alabama Missing Persons database until December 23rd, which was nearly a full week after his family reported him missing. This delay significantly reduced the chances of garnering early media attention or interagency cooperation, factors that are often critical in missing person cases, especially those that cross state lines. During this window of silence, if Ronnie had been taken against his will, valuable time was lost in tracking his movements or identifying persons of interest. The family's growing frustration with the Huntsville Police Department was made even worse when they reportedly learned through the media that Ronnie's case had been reclassified as an abduction. This lack of transparency and communication showed a stunning level of disrespect and disorganization, especially considering the gravity of the situation. Additionally, family members have alleged that police were dismissive, used profanity, and even threatened them when they tried to release surveillance footage that could have generated leads. Instead of working collaboratively with Ronnie's loved ones, who were actively uncovering clues and pursuing suspects on their own, law enforcement appeared defensive and disinterested. So, despite the huge amounts of evidence available, the truth is, we are still no closer to finding out the truth. But what remains heartbreakingly clear is that Ronald's family have had to fight tirelessly for every single update, and their persistent advocacy is what turned a stalled missing person case into a criminal investigation. So with this in mind, please make sure to share this story with as many people as you can, as I fear that without our support, Ronnie's family may never receive the closure they deserve. Anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here. But as always, if you have any other theories of your own which you think may help explain what really happened to Ronald Dumas Jr., please leave your ideas in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these stories. Also, if you found this video interesting, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now, which covers the many other cases of people of colour who continue to disappear across America, sometimes never to be seen alive again.